not be more pleased and excited to introduce our board members, Dr. Robert Nelson, Robin, who is the president of the board of the Jamison Foundation, and Jonathan Harris, who is the scientific advisor, even though they're both the scientific advisors. And we just got our 501c3 approval about 2 months ago. Our foundation was created, Dane and I, my husband Dane, where'd you go? He's back there, okay. Dane and I created, had the idea to do something with this wonderful collection of art that our son left when he passed away. And we wanted to do, have a dual mission that we both kept the art out and available for people to see and get it around to as many places as we can. And we also wanted to try to sort of untangle some of the issues that he was going through. So to make some help available for people that are suffering similar situations. He had definitely dual diagnosis, addiction, mental illness, wasn't completely ever totally sorted out by the time he wasn't completely diagnosed, I would say, by the time he passed away. But he was a complicated individual, and you can see, I think, if you take a look at the art, if you haven't already been to the show, some of the artwork around the outside of the room is early in his life. Well, this was all done between the ages of 15 and 19. So the older stuff is around the outside of the room, and it's more simple, and that was done before he picked up any drugs or alcohol. And then probably the most dysfunctional piece, the largest piece in the back there, was done right before he went into treatment at Karen. And he was at a very bad point in his life at that point. And then some of these smaller pieces up in the front were done when he was in treatment and he was clean and sober. Probably my favorite one is the one called Lemon Eye, which is the black-haired girl on the second panel at the top. And I think that if you look at it, one of the things that I think it's interesting to look at this artwork just to sort of observe what was going on inside of his mind. Everything, there was much more expressed on the page than there ever was when you talked to the boy. So to me, those pieces when he was sober are much more clear. They're much more confident and more organized. And the ones when he was messed up are interesting, but they don't have a focus. They're chaotic. So anyway, sorry that was a little digression, but just to give you kind of a orientation to the art, if you have time to stay afterwards and take a look at it. The other thing that our foundation is doing, around the corner we have an exhibit called Against the Wind, which is our first attempt to sort of take some of the information that we are working on, addiction, mental illness, and creativity, and try to dive in and give it, look at it from a scientific point of view. Even though the room is very colorful and participatory, there are things that you can do, touch, make, think about, look at. We're trying to base that all on scientific evidence and just communicate facts, because we're well aware that anything our little foundation does is not going to cure any of these problems or do away with them or save anyone, at one fell swoop, but what we can do is offer information. So that's where our wonderful doctors come into play. There could not be more expert minds, I think, in the whole planet, I'm gonna say. Dr. Nelson has been working with people with substance use disorder for how many years?
20 some odd.
20 some odd years. Many of you may know him in that capacity. Really deep into the Berks County recovery community, who's been around for a lot of us. And Dr. Jonathan Harris is a relatively new addition to our community, moving here in, I think, how many years ago, Jonathan? About 5 or 6 years ago. And now is the head of neuroscience at the Karen Foundation. Is that right? Yes. And with some exciting new projects going on up there. And also we were at the retirement dinner for Doug Tiemann, and they're building a gigantic wing that's going to be Jonathan's wing. It's like the Jonathan realm. So he's here to give us some of his update about recent developments in the area of brain science. So with no further ado, you two, I think you've worked out what you're going to do. Come on up here. You can both sit down or speak one at a time, or speak once and then sit. Okay. All right. So Jonathan's going to go first. Jonathan Harris.
Well, I appreciate that introduction. Let me see if I can turn this on. There we go. So I can talk about a few things, but really I'm a neuroscientist by training, so that's what I'll be talking about. I'll be talking about the brain. And we figured that since the brain is very scientific and science can be a little bit boring at times, we'll have me go first so that we can get the boring stuff out of the way and talk about the juicy stuff a little bit later. So I'll talk about the brain, and I'll talk about how the brain is associated with addiction, some of the brain correlates of addiction, and I'll keep it pretty much in an overview. As a show of hands, how many people here feel like they have some background, some basic understanding about the way the brain is structured, the way it functions? A couple of people, good, okay. And some people who don't know a whole lot about it, so we'll keep it as fun as we can. Because I can go pretty deep in this, but maybe not on a Tuesday evening. There. All right. So you guys can see that. All right. So just to dive right in then, the human brain. Yeah, so this is what I study. This is what I found to be most fascinating, and we're going to be doing a lot of research about this with Karen, even more than we have. We have the research facility opening up in the next couple of months, and we have a few projects already lined up. And it's going to be projects related to addiction, some projects related to the brain in addiction, and just to go into that and talk about the brain and talk about how the brain is structured and make sense of it all. Because this is a big piece of what underlies addiction and why people can be addicted to anything in the first place. So the human brain is probably the most complex organism in the known universe, actually, that we know of. And I would say in terms of the way it's comprised, the way it functions in two different ways that I think are both very important. One is electrically, and the other is chemically. And both of those are important, and we'll talk a little bit about why. In terms of the brain, you guys can see the brain in the background. It's basically this big blob of 3-pound goo that is between your ears, a little ways behind your eyes, and is responsible for a lot of what you're experiencing right now. And the basic unit, the basic cell of the brain is something called a neuron. And a neuron is a specialized cell. And it's specialized for one thing, the transmission of information, so that you can make sense of the world inside of you and the world around you. And so it's got a lot of neurons. Any guesses as to how many neurons are in the brain? The human brain. Thousands? Millions? Billions with a B. That's 100 billion is the estimate. And what's interesting is that between neurons, neurons run a certain length, and I'll actually show a slide of that. Next, between neurons is a space, and that's also really important. That space is called the synapse. And one of the interesting things about the brain is that each neuron can have a synapse with up to 1,000 other neurons, which means that there's the potential for about 100 trillion synapses in the brain. That's 100 trillion different connections that can be made. And that's responsible for everything that we're experiencing and why reality seems inexplicable. Because the basis for understanding that is also pretty inexplicable. So just to show you a little bit about neurons. So you guys have probably seen photos like this before. Lots of these stringy wires going everywhere. And neurons, like I mentioned before, they function electrically and chemically. So the electrical activity of neurons, it's actually not that unlike the wires running through your wall. It's a propagation of electricity, just running down the length of what they call an axon. And it runs down until it gets to the end of the neuron. And at the end of the neuron, you reach something called the synapse. And that's basically just a gap between one neuron and the next. And what you're seeing here, how many of you have seen a photo like that or a picture like that? You understand kind of what's going on. So that's the space between two neurons. And I have a whole slide because it's important. What's going on here is when the propagation of the signal gets to the end of the neuron, which is electrical, it switches over, and then it becomes a chemical transmission from one neuron to the next. And the reason that's important is because that's the basis for a lot of why we feel the way we feel, why we have the capacity to learn new things, why we change in result of our experience, our life experience. And it's also why people can get addicted to drugs. Because if we didn't have chemical spaces in our brains, there would be no place for drugs to act on. So this is where drugs come in and mess with us. It's in the synapse. It's also interesting too, because if the brain was completely electrical, then we probably would be really similar to computers, because computers are electrical circuits. And they don't change. They're designed, they're manufactured, and they're set up, and that's it. But humans have the capacity to have these synapses that are capable of changing. So if each neuron has 1,000 other synapses, they're changing all the time based on what we see, based on what we feel, based on what we're doing, based on what we're learning. That's why we can remember things and form new memories. It's because these synapses are changing. And so that's a really important piece of why we are the way we are. And I also mentioned that's where addiction comes into play. What's interesting, especially about addiction to substances or addiction to drugs, is that drugs of abuse they're affecting that exact space in the brain. And they affect it in different areas, and we're going to talk about the brain and the structure in actually the next slide. But what happens is drugs actually act in the same way as our brains naturally do. In fact, our brains are basically bathed in drugs. We just don't call them drugs because they're on the inside, not on the outside. But drugs from the outside, they look the same, they act the same. And when you take them and they get into the brain, they mess with what's going on here. And what they can do is they can cause increased transmission to the next neuron in line. Let me see if I can move my mouse here. Yeah. So what's typically happening is that the neuron will have some kind of signal that comes through here, like I said before, electrically. Once it gets to the end here, basically there's something that says, okay, release those drugs into the synapse so that this next neuron here can pick it up and then fire and take it off to the next neuron. Now drugs will actually come right in here and actually activate this next neuron independently. And that's pretty common. Or what they could do is they could come in here and block the recycling of the neurotransmitters here that aren't being used. And so that's what's going on. The reason why we can become addicted is because we have these synapses. So there's chemicals. Our brain functions chemically, and there's chemicals in our brain already. In the brain, we have a special term for these. That term is called, does anybody want to take a guess?
Neurotransmitters.
Neurotransmitters, yes, I heard that, absolutely. And there's a whole bunch of them. There's like dopamine, there's glutamate, there's serotonin, there's GABA, there's all kinds. The one that we'll probably hear, actually we will hear, and I'll talk more about is the one called dopamine, which is central to addiction. Anybody have any questions about that? Just to throw it out. Yeah.
Is it always going from one, is that happening in both directions at the same time?
Good question. For the most part, it's unidirectional. However, it can get really complicated, and there can be another neuron that sends one back that says, actually, I've fired enough. I don't want you to fire anymore, and then it'll just shut the whole system down. So it can do that too. So that's electrically and chemically. That's the way our brains are comprised at the most fundamental level. Now, when you put 100 billion of those together, what you get is something that looks like what we imagine when we see a brain, and this is an image of the brain from the side. If you had somebody's face in here, their eyeball would be up here, and the back of their head would be here. This would be their forehead right here. And so when we put all this together, there's a number of brain systems that all work together, and they all work in different ways, in kind of complex ways. And when people describe the brain, it's really interesting, the human brain in particular. It's not a very well-designed organ. It's not like the cell phone in your pocket that a bunch of engineers sat down with, decided to throw out the old cell phone plan and put in a brand new cell phone plan in terms of the design of the circuitry and the what you can see in the front and the antenna and everything. This is something that was just built one piece right on top of the next, right on top of the next. And it wasn't really that well laid out. But it's doing its job, and we're here. And this is what's going on. So at the base, you may have heard a couple of different terms for these different systems, and I'll just talk about different ones. So at the base of the brain, kind of down here, there's no real clear demarcation line, but this is basically called the hindbrain. Sometimes people call it the reptilian brain. You guys may have heard that before. The reason it's called the reptilian brain is because it's got the same basic stuff as reptiles have going on, which is the stuff that you need to survive. So these are the functions. This is responsible for keeping you alive. When you wake up in the morning, it gets you awake, keeps your heart beating at a certain level, keeps you breathing while you're sleeping. And all of what's going on here, you're not aware of. You don't know anything about it. And it's probably a good thing because it would be too much information. You don't want to have to think while you're listening to me to think, oh yeah, take another breath. Maybe I have to think that, but you don't have to think that. And so this is all the hindbrain. This is all the reptilian brain that's going on here. Now, what's kind of on top of this and a little growing out of it is the middle area of the brain. And this is called the limbic system, or the limbic brain. I'm generalizing this a little bit, but for the most part, this is the emotional center of the brain. This is why we feel as much as we feel. This is why humans connect with other humans the way they do. And this is why, this is one of the things that makes us different from reptiles who will just lay some eggs and walk away. We're bonding creatures, and we have really a very strong capacity for feeling and relationships with others. And the brain basis for that is what's happening here in the limbic system. And we're actually going to talk quite a bit, I'm going to talk quite a bit about this on this slide. But I'll come back to it in a second, because what's outside here, which is what most of you see when you see a brain from the outside, which is all the squiggly stuff, the gooey stuff, this is the cortex. Cortex means just like the bark, it's the outer area of the brain. And this is the part of the brain that helps you pay attention, that helps you see things and be aware that you see things, help you think things through, stop for a moment, select one thing instead of thinking about another thing, and imagine what you're going to do next. That's all happening in the cortex. And in the very front of the brain, it's called the prefrontal. Oops, I skipped the slide there. We'll see that in a second. That's actually a really cool slide. The prefrontal cortex is what's right in your forehead. And that is probably the most human aspect of the brain itself, because that's the part that's the most evolved, that's the most different, that's what differentiates us from most other animals. And also I'd say why humans have built skyscrapers and airplanes and other animals are kind of still playing around in the dirt is because we have the capacity to think and engineer and design, and that's a pretty big basis of our prefrontal cortex. So that's the brain as it's viewed from a systems level. Multiple systems all build on top of each other, and sometimes, actually a lot of times, they're not working together. A lot of times they're working in opposition, they're struggling and they're fighting, and that's also probably why we often feel in conflict even with ourselves. Like, I want this, but I can't have that. I'll actually talk about that too, because that's what we're going to get into right here. So I said the middle area here, the limbic system, is about emotions, for the most part. It's about feeling. It's the part of you that you can really feel something. And there's a lot of different subsystems in here, and there's a lot of different neurotransmitters that give different flavors of feeling. But there's one that's really significant in addiction, and that's one that is kind of highlighted here. It starts down here. There's something called, I don't know how well you can see that. Can you see it says VTA? All right, this will be on the quiz later. This is the ventral tegmental area. You don't have to know that. It's the area of the brain that synthesizes the neurotransmitter called dopamine. And what happens is dopamine's created down here, and then it rides up this pathway until somewhere just kind of behind the eyes, into an area called the nucleus accumbens. Has anybody heard of the nucleus accumbens before? Yeah. So this is a big hot spot in the brain. And about 75 years ago, nobody knew that. People were researching that, and they didn't know what they were doing. And in fact, they were doing surgeries where they were putting electrodes into people's brains and electrically stimulating them. And they found out that some people really liked that. They liked it a lot. And I've heard stories, I don't know if they're actually true, but to the degree that certain people were given kind of like a push button activity, where they could press a button and they would stimulate that area of the brain. And that's actually why we don't really do that. There's a lot of reasons why we don't do that anymore. But one of the reasons why is because they would press it so often, they wouldn't stop pressing it. Because it was some of the most profound and euphoric experiences they ever had. This area is called the pleasure center of the brain. And it's where dopamine gets dumped into the brain. So the experience of dopamine running from the ventral tegmental area into the nucleus accumbens, that pathway, that's called the brain reward system. And that's actually the most fundamental brain piece of addiction. Because what happens is that when people use drugs, what's going on is it activates that system. And dopamine gets released. And people are like, oh, that was great. Let's do that again. And so, that's just the brain doing what the brain does. And so any drug of abuse that somebody finds that they like is going to be activating that system. And what happens, it gets activated over and over and over again. And it becomes the main system that people become attuned to. So a couple things about that. It actually doesn't matter what the drug is. It could be alcohol, it could be cocaine, it could be heroin. All drugs of abuse are known to activate this pathway. And they activate it in different ways. They go through different neurotransmitter systems. The one that actually acts directly on this system are the stimulants, stimulant class. They cause almost a direct activation of dopamine. And that's why they're so powerful. And that's all, most of the time they're very fast acting because they act directly and cause the release of dopamine. So alcohol is it has a side pathway, opiates have another side pathway. But what ends up happening over time? When somebody's using a drug over and over again, they become very sensitive, they become sensitized to this experience of, oh, okay, I feel good, I feel very alive, I want this, and I want more of this. And that's exactly what the human experience is when you line it up with what's happening in the brain. And when somebody extends that over like a long period of time, chronic use, what ends up happening is within the same limbic system, when I said we had like a variety of flavors of emotion, some of those end up getting trimmed away. People don't feel the same range of feelings that they felt before. And that's somewhat consistent too with when somebody progresses further and further into addiction, what ends up happening is their life in general, in many ways, becomes more and more narrow and becomes more and more isolated in relation to just one thing. And it's interesting because there's somewhat of a parallel that's happening in the brain, and that's that other aspects of the limbic system are kind of being turned off, and the dopamine system is being turned on. And so it's being used and overused. And it's being used also to kind of change how people feel. So if I'm not feeling well, I know that this is going to make me feel better, so the dopamine system will take over. And it's pretty reliable. It just makes sense. It's pretty predictable, and we're hardwired for this. It's the way our brains are structured. So, in terms of what's happening here, I would say that if we could say the human vehicle is like, we could say that we are like a car or a vehicle. The dopamine system, the nucleus accumbens, the brain reward system, that's the gas pedal. That's like, let's go, I want to go. I want to move forward, I want to move forward fast. It's the turn-on system. And so the other system, which I mentioned, there's some kind of competing or conflicting systems, is what's happening right up front here, is the prefrontal cortex, which is a little bit more rational, has the capacity to think things through a little bit, sometimes has the capacity to inhibit a response or switch in a different direction. And so sometimes the analogy here is that the prefrontal cortex, or at least the front of the brain, is kind of like the brakes of the brakes, or the steering. It can change directions or just slow down. And so when somebody is further and further into addiction, there's more and more competition between what's happening in the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and what's happening down here in the lower areas. And so you have a system where the gas pedal is ready to be like thrust on, and the brakes are failing. The steering's beginning to not be reliable. And if you could imagine driving a car that way, I mean, it's liable to crash. And there's a pretty analogous happening with people, with the same kind of situation. It's very interesting to see the parallel with what's happening at the brain systems level. Anybody have any questions about that? Yeah.
Behaviors are the same, right? The same behavioral addictions are all.
Yes. Yeah, they're a little bit more insidious because you don't need a chemical, but the response is the same. It's really about it's about the excitation of dopamine, and it's almost as if this has been programmed for people to respond and say next video, next photo, next photo, same kind of thing. Yeah, fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things I showed you a sneak peek on the next slide is what that looks like in a PET scan. I saw another question now.
So when part of that brain shuts off, because the dopamine's exploring, can they ever turn back on again?
Great question. I would say that's yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because that would be the opposite direction of what addiction is, which is recovery. And I would say, actually, just to speak on that for a moment, I would say recovery is a quieting of the dopamine system, almost bringing the whole brain back into a state of regulation, homeostasis, where at first dopamine is going to be seeking activity however it can. And that's also why sometimes people will put down one drug and pick up another, or some other behavior, is because dopamine just wants to be turned on. It doesn't care how. And anything that does it will do it, and that's good enough for dopamine. But when somebody's going through early recovery and the system is recovering, and it's not a period where somebody feels that great. That's what withdrawal is. That system will begin to normalize. Dopamine will begin to quiet down. The prefrontal cortex will begin to come back online more and more. And that's something that we have studied to some degree, and there's a lot of study about that. But it takes months, if not years, and in many ways it can go on beyond that, because things become even more complex, especially when the rest of in this limbic system here, when those varieties of flavors come back online. And that's what really serves to protect people from going back and just using dopamine over and over again, because they can feel things again, and they don't necessarily need dopamine. That's a little bit more complicated, but yes, it takes some time, but yes, it does. Great question. Yeah.
So, would it make sense that the longer they are using, the longer it would take for that part to heal?
Yeah.
Versus a shorter addiction period versus a much longer
Yeah,
time period?
I would agree with that, because I think also it speaks to that addiction is a continuum. It's not that somebody is addicted or is not addicted, but it's a progression, and that as it progresses, it gets worse and worse, and in that same way, dopamine is becoming more and more in the spotlight. And in that sense, someone's response to the way they're living and their relationship with their thing, that becomes very strong. And so the stronger that becomes, the longer it takes to let that relationship go. Yeah.
If a person experiences long-term recovery and then decides to go or returns to substance use disorder, do your brain goes back to what was the most, I don't want to say damaged, but altered state, or does it take a period of time? Is it like a zing to your brain? And then you find yourself with the emotions that you've numbed away for quite some time?
Yeah. I think the most honest answer I can give you is not sure. I think to some degree, the brain is, here's an analogy I could give. I think the brain is very susceptible to going back to where it was. But I think if it has been a long time, there's a lot of protection there. And there's a lot of capacity to bounce back too. I think analogy would be like forming a path through the woods. And over time, if you don't walk that path, the trees will grow in and the path will begin to decay. And you can certainly walk that path again and brush away and clear it out. But the longer you go that it decays, the more it will take to bring it back. It never fully decays, but it's hard to know exactly, and it's probably different for everybody. Yeah.
This may be sort of a dumb question. So say you have multiple addictions, I'll actually use myself. I have two major ones, alcohol and emotional spending. Does the dopamine work the same for both of those? Even though the emotional spending is not like alcohol or a drug?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. In some sense, it would work a little bit different, but in some sense, they're probably working fundamentally in a similar way. And that's something to explore. What's bringing this about? And I would say for everybody, it's probably different. Yeah.
Thank you.
So the next slide I have is it's a really interesting PET scan, which is a certain kind of brain scan that shows activity in the brain. And what you're seeing here, especially on the far right, is what happens over the course of the first 30 minutes when somebody takes cocaine. This was done in a laboratory. It was approved of probably by the NIH, I assume. I don't know. And what you see is the areas that go most to yellow and brighten up the most. That's the area of the brain that's taking in the most dopamine, and that would be the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure center of the brain. So it's really interesting where that's happening. You can see it's kind of in the middle area. And it's also interesting to see that even within the first 30 minutes, it's already dying down. So it's very powerful, and then it dies down. And that's also one of the things about cocaine, is that the pharmacokinetics are very fast, and it moves through very quickly, but it's very powerful. So that's most of what I wanted to share about the brain, addiction in the brain. There's one thing that I wanted to speak to bring it towards what else we can talk about, which is what addiction is and how that relates to creativity. And then I'll pass it off to Dr. Nelson to take it from there. And one of the things I'll say is creativity is not something that I have studied well in terms of a neuroscience basis. I would say from a neuroscience perspective, it could be quite a mystery still. I mean, in some sense, it's the aspect of what makes us very human. You don't see squirrels or monkeys creating art that I've seen. And it's one of the things that we do as an expression of our own generativity when our survival needs have been met. And one of the things that I would say about creativity and the creation of something is that people who have the capacity to create something, it's a magnificent work of art, have the capacity to really focus on very, very minute differences. Whether that's a minute difference in flavor of something they're cooking, or even just the colors that they're painting. And I would say the basis for that, the one thing that I would speak to, the basis for that would be sensitivity. And I would say that sensitivity is the power of creativity in some sense. And that's not just sensitivity on the outside, but also sensitivity on the inside, that the capacity to sense so many things, so many flavors of emotion, so many things happening on the inside, may also give rise to the capacity to create something that's so magnificent. But with sensitivity also is the range of feeling, that you can feel good and you can also feel bad. And so if, one of the things about being human is nobody likes to feel that. So it's important that there's something that's supportive and nurturing and protective about that, because the risk would then be, the vulnerability would then be to turn to something that reliably changes how somebody feels to make them feel good. And that's where dopamine comes in. And that's where people seek that out. Something to reliably feel better or to take away some kind of pain. And that's really where I was going to bring creativity and also lead us to what Dr. Nelson has to share.
Before you do that, what
Yeah.
part of the brain is it that mental health is connected? Is
I
that
think
it?
actually that would be a great question for Dr. Nelson.
Okay. Awesome.
So, there we go. I'm just gonna leave that up because it's a brain, So hi, I'm Robin Nelson, and it's really an honor to be here. If I get loud, please forgive me. I tend to get loud when I get, upbeat, and also I'm about 6 inches closer to the mic than Dr. Harris. So, we had 2 brain people talking tonight, and so I was in my default mode of, okay, I'll tell them everything I know about psychiatry. And I decided I really needed to push myself and think hard about the question that really this room forces us to think about, which is there a connection between these mental health issues, between addiction, and between creativity? Is there some connection that we should be striving to find? And if so, how do we help people harness it? Is there something we need to protect people from? Is there some danger in treating illness? Like, is part of their creativity tied to their mental illness? And if I rob them of their illness, do I rob them of their creativity? And that's something I've struggled with for 25 years, because I'm a musician. I am somebody who values the arts greatly. And I know that some of our greatest musicians of all time, and I mean, have been affected by mental illness, and we wonder what would have happened to them if they hadn't had it, right? Would Edgar Allan Poe have been going, oh, nice birdie, if he had had Prozac, right? And we don't know the answer to that, but it's something that it's worth us exploring. And so one of the first things I thought about is this real? Is there really a connection between art, mental health, and chemical dependency? And one of the things that you look at first, whenever you read anything about this, they always give you lists. Lots and lots of lists. And there are lists. And the lists are really quite exhaustive. Shelley, Keats, Mark Twain, Byron, Tchaikovsky, Schumann, Van Gogh, Billy Joel, Catherine Zeta-Jones. You can go on and on and on from historical all the way to very much in the present, that there are gobs and gobs of artists who have been affected by some sort of mental illness. And a lot of people take that and they assume that there's a connection. On the other hand, there are plumbers who have mental illness. There are people who don't have jobs at all, who have mental illness. So that's not necessarily a proof of causation. There's an association. We can certainly look at it and we can examine it. Now, so you go to the researchers in the field. And I, used to do some research. The scientific community at large is rather glad I don't anymore. And but you look at research on this area, and one of the most sort of prolific writers about this connection, her name's Redfield Jamison. And I see some nods. Yeah, she wrote An Unquiet Mind, which is the seminal book on bipolar disorder. Okay. And she's brilliant, still is a brilliant psychologist, retired now, so from Johns Hopkins, psychologist, and makes no secret about bipolar 1, lithium responsive, really serious symptoms, which she manages on her own by changing her own dose of lithium, which is crazy. But anyway, and she looked at this question and went on to write a whole book about it called Touch with Fire. But one of her bigger papers of this was she was in England, and she interviewed 47 artists in England, all of whom had either won some remarkably prestigious award or were members of the Royal Academy of Arts. And these were poets, writers, artists, biographers. They were more normal, but a collection of artists in their field. And this paper was written in 1989, and what's remarkable is that when she looked at this, she found that 38% of her sample had some history of a mood disorder, which is 38%, right? Average for even unipolar in any given year is 6 to 8%. In lifetime, it's maybe 16 to 18%. Bipolar's 2% or something like that. So, remarkably enriched sample. Now, of course, there could be biases to that. There's a filter bias. What is the bias of, if I go into the Royal Academy and say, hi, I'm a psychologist, I want to talk to you about mood disorders. Well, who's going to talk to me? Staid British, uptight people, or, people who maybe are affected already. So you're going to have some sample bias there. But what's interesting is when she looked under the hood, of those 38%, most of them did not carry a diagnosis for bipolar disorder. And yet, 89%, I just wanted to make sure I had that number right, 89% of them had a history of some episode, even if it had never been diagnosed, of great increase in creativity, spark in enthusiasm, increased self-confidence, increased fluidity of thought, increased emotional intensity, expansiveness. It's not hard to draw a line from that to that, right? Small writing, vivid colors, a lot going on. maybe some confusion, maybe it's hard to interpret, but it reflects a certain pattern that you do see in art at times, or you can see in the written word at times. And you can hear in music. I mean, when Igor Stravinsky's Rite of Spring played in 1906, there were riots in Moscow. I think Moscow, maybe St. Petersburg, I forget. Anyway, this is emotionally evocative because art is supposed to be emotionally evocative. It pushes boundaries, and it may not fall within given norms, may not stay within the lines because, let's face it, art is not supposed to fall within the lines. If it's not breaking ground, do you bother going? Maybe, maybe not. So there does intuitively feel like there's a connection, there's at least an association, although we can't prove that it's necessarily causal. And I think that's a really important thing that my review of the literature did not find. I didn't find anybody proving to me that this was a causal link. It's certainly an association, and I'll come back to why I think that's really important later. The other thing I think is really important that the research largely ignores is attention problems. And that's why I put the, no, wrong slide. That's why I put the slide back up. Because there's a really important issue here, and the literature on the connection between art and mental health largely ignores it because in 1989, ADHD didn't exist. It kind of existed. It was mostly reserved, however, for 7-year-old lighting fires. Okay, this was, something that was presumed to evaporate by the time you were 18, because it has to be hardwired. It has to exist before you're 7. So therefore, it must then rewire itself when you're 18. That made sense. No, it doesn't. Right? It turns out that it sticks around for a long, long time, and yet people really didn't pay much attention to it at the time. But this is another aspect, I think, that we really need to investigate because it's one of these key systems here. So Dr. Harris was talking about the prefrontal cortex, that area up front. I call it the Mr. Spock part of the brain, right? It's very focused. It's good at weighing out its options. It thinks things through. It doesn't say what it has in mind right away. It thinks about it a little bit, right? It can stay on task and it can do things that are even really, really boring, right? So think about, could there be a connection there with art and maybe having some difficulty with that conformity part of the brain? Because, if you think about it, the prefrontal cortex is taking in all that information, and where's it getting that information from? It's getting it from our tribe. And it is spinning it back so that why? So that the tribe doesn't vote us off the island, right? Because there are ground rules we need to stay in or we will be voted off. And some are more serious than others, and the prefrontal cortex is supposed to learn them all, and it's supposed to recite them back, and it's supposed to be able to do it in real time so that we can act appropriately, just act appropriately, right? That's the job of the prefrontal cortex. Should it be surprising? Now you'll notice that coming out of the VTA, the tegmental area, are several different lines in different colors, right? We focused on the one going to the nucleus accumbens, the reward center, right? But you'll notice another one of those lines goes to the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex also runs on dopamine. So should it be shocking to us that people who have a deficit in their prefrontal cortex, aka have a decrease in the dopamine up there, might also have some difficulty activating their nucleus accumbens, might also have deficits in their inherent ability to activate that reward center. They might be starting out the gate a little bit dulled there. What does that mean? Well, in ADHD, what it means is, let's think of, I'm gonna confabulate an artist, okay? How many people's artist origin story starts in the margin of a spiral notebook in third period social studies class? Right? How many people get into their art, whether it be visual art, whether it be their writing, whether it be their music, because, you know, school was going on, but they had better things to do? Yes, absolutely. And in fact, if you think about all those people who are, you know, doing their homework, even though it's boring, they're getting their grades, they're succeeding. And then you have somebody who, you know, they mean well, they really intend to do the work, they don't get it done, they end up not progressing, not doing what the tribe wants them to do. But there's one class where there's one teacher who thinks they've actually got promise. I see some nods, right? It's their art class. That this is potentially part of how we gravitate people toward the field. They're not having success here. They've got something that they naturally gravitate to here and that they can feel success in here. They gravitate that direction. We all gravitate toward those things that we feel success in. We just do. The other thing is, ADHD can actually be helpful. Right? People with ADD are better at nonconformist thinking. That's been shown, actually. You do studies of people on divergent thinking, right? I'm going to hand you a shovel. Tell me 15 things you can do with it. People with ADD will beat the pants off of you. They can think of 15 things you do with a shovel. Some of them aren't things I would recite up here. But yeah, they'll be able to tell you different divergent thinking, thinking that's outside the box, thinking that is multiprocessing instead of linear. Again, something that can have a great deal to do with creating great art. These are part of that process. There is an advantage to having decentralization in the brain as opposed to top-down rigid control. That's why Kirk runs the enterprise, not Mr. Spock, right? So, okay, at this point I'm thinking, this is awesome. I'm going to get me a bipolar and ADHD. I need some disorders, right? Sounds great. I need to be an artist. There's a flip side, isn't there? Right? Awful lot of pain comes with this. Read histories of Shelley or Blake or Mark Twain, or read the struggles that they went through. Read about Tchaikovsky's attempted suicide. Read about Hemingway's actual suicide. There's intense pain. So, is it worth it? Does the art justify it? Do we as a society do better because Hemingway died? I don't think so. So if we try to look at this, what are the associations and what are the drivers? So let's think about it. Okay, so we see that a lot of people are creating art potentially as a way of expressing their emotion. So people with wider range of emotions, maybe they have a wider range of expression. People who have ADD maybe will have greater flexibility, greater decentralization of their thinking, and yet at the same time, great social cost. People with ADD have 3 times the car accident rate than other people. They have higher divorce rates, they have higher incarceration rates. It's not just about getting through 8th period math class. ADD has huge social costs for the people who have it. So, do we treat? Or if we do, will we make them worse artists? Would Van Gogh have made Starry Night if he wasn't ill? I don't know, and I don't care. I would have been willing to trade it in for 50 more years of Van Gogh to figure it out. So, is there an association? Yes. But does mental health drive creativity? I would say no. It may help drive people toward art, or their ADD may help push them toward their interest. But after that, it's a craft. Art is something you develop. Art is something that you nurture. Art is something that you work on. It's work. It's the 10,000 hours they talk about. And once you're in it, you maybe could stabilize your mood and still do it. And maybe you won't have the flight of passion in which you do, 51 Federalist Papers in 1 year, right? But maybe you'll be on a more slow and steady path toward gradual creation. Maybe you'll slow down the gas pedal. But maybe you can still create, because what is creation? Creation is inherently human. People can inherently create without necessarily having disorder. And that's why this foundation needs to grow and exist, because we know that there's an association, but it doesn't have to be a sentence. People need to be in their art. We need to pull these people toward art, whether or not they have mental health issues that drove them there in the first place. But we need to encourage them once they get there, so that we can treat their mental illness. Because why? Because mental illness does have this big connection with substance use. And substance use, A, makes crappy artists. It deteriorates their art. They feel like it's good art at the time, but in retrospect, ask any artist in recovery, they like the stuff they do sober better. And because this is where a lot of the cost comes. There is connection, there is comorbidity between mood disorders and substance abuse. There is comorbidity between ADHD and substance abuse. There are other mental illnesses that may play a role in art, but I didn't research them. But we know that there are at least those connections, and probably more, right? There are neurotransmitters. There are 200 neurotransmitters yet, and counting, right? On a good day, we mess with 11. I counted once. 12 if you smoke pot. But I mean, we need to get that treatment out there. We need to take the artists who are out there, have them create their craft, and not do it at so much of a cost. And that's all. Any questions for either of us before we all? We'll sit, so it'll be less formal. Yeah.
Yeah, something just to introduce and ask your thoughts on introducing trauma into the mix with the chemicals and so forth. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I can. Do I need the mic?
No.
Okay. So the question's about trauma, and can I admit that I purposely left that paragraph out of my talk? And we know that there's association with trauma. If you think about the two things that I'm talking about, right? Mood disorders and attention problems. Both of which are some of the most inheritable conditions in psychiatry, right? If you want inheritability in psychiatry, if you're in a socialized medicine country, if you live in Holland and you're a twin, they study the snot out of you, okay? And you could be a twin separated at birth, and twins, with their concordant family, and adopted twins. And so you do these linkages studies, and what's genetic? And schizophrenia tops it. It's about 70% concordance with, so if you have two identical twins, one's got schizophrenia, what's the chance of the other? It's about 70%. Bipolar is like right next in line, it's in the 60s. ADHD, right next in line, it's in the 60s. Maybe even upwards, approaching 70. And so, hang on one second. So how does this link in with trauma? Well, so you've got kids with a mood disorder or attention problem who are being raised by people with mood disorders or an attention problem or both, right? Because there's a lot of comorbidity between mood disorders and attention deficit. And so the kids are higher need, pesky, difficult, and the parents have lower frustration tolerance and a tendency towards impulsivity and sometimes wide range of emotion, we'll just say. This is a setup for trauma. So it is not shocking at all that when you read Touched with Fire by Jamison, and you read histories of some of these artists. She does genealogies, and it's actually a very good book. It's old now, but it's still really good. That trauma is an inherent part of some of these lives. Again, can that be the foundation for some people's art? Yes, and it could be amazing. Does that mean that we should let the person languish in it? No. A person can still, I believe, tap in, and this is the part that I have no proof for, but I've been doing it for 25 years, so I'm allowed to stay stuff out my butt anyway. That in my experience treating people with these conditions, that you can get them better and they can still tap into what it was to be worse. That if they need to channel that experience of being a powerless person being abused, they have ready access to it. They may want to touch it gingerly. They may want to approach it with great trepidation, but they can access it if they choose to. And if that brought out a piece of their art that they thought was, then that's part of their experience, and it's a story that should be told. But it doesn't mean that they shouldn't get treatment to try to make that more bearable for them, because trauma is an unbearable thing for many people. Some people, it's awful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does borderline personality disorder tie in with those?
Borderline's hard because for many, many years, borderline was stigmatized by folks like me who were just really, really pissed off that they couldn't get them better. And so they said all sorts of things like, these people don't want to get better. And it was mostly a bunch of Freudians who actually made people worse, because that's what Freudian psychiatry does to borderline. And I apologize, there were some Freudian techniques that weren't awful, mostly. Better techniques came along, and we've really had this enormous renaissance, really basically during my career. Like, from the very start of my career to now has been like, thank God we can finally treat borderline in a comprehensive and humane way. We still don't have meds for it, and of course I'm a med guy. So, but having worked an awful lot with it, can it play a role in forming creation of art? And does it ever? I would say absolutely yes, mostly because my feeling on borderline, and this is my first 2-3 years out of residency, was as the outpatient doc attached to the second or third largest DBT clinic in the country.
Oh.
I was the doc.
Where is it?
University of Rochester. They were one of the first adopters of dialectical behavior therapy, and it was basically after Washington, like 5 years later, they were doing it. And so they had one of the bigger, it was a lot of people. It was in the hundreds of people in their DBT program. And they took the junior new attending and decided that would be a good role for me. And it was. And so I had to think up something fast because these people did not have anything that I could reference in the physician's test reference and say, this is indicated for the treatment of borderline personality disorder. And so what did I derive? I derived that there are 4 food groups to borderline, and that is mood disorder, bipolar versus major depression or smatterings of both, attention deficit, which a lot of people ignore because it didn't exist before 1990 or so, trauma, PTSD, and other forms of anxiety. You know, just generalized anxiety, other stuff in anxiety. And, you know, if you, as a med guy, then turn on the mute button to all the other stuff that encompasses borderline and just try to focus on, well, what can I dig out? If I look underneath a layer or two, what can I dig out that I do have meds for? Those tend to be the 4 things you find. And then you can start to derive a med regimen for them. And so could any of those 4 food groups play a role in deriving art? I would think absolutely. How many people have made fabulous art out of their anxiety? Yeah, there you go. And,
I actually brought some of my art today.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would say yeah. Yeah.
So I heard you speak a little bit about deficit cortex and emotions. Is it true that emotionally fueled people, their thought process bypasses the cortex part of the brain? And how did you, I guess, even start to diagnose somebody like that, whether they're emotionally fueled and it bypasses the cortex part of the brain?
Right. Okay. So this is when I get nervous having a real neuroscience next to me. When you feel an emotion down here in the limbic area, it comes up, and again, this is the area of the brain we do actually have in common with much lower creatures, right? So down here is lizards, but you know, some of this is kind of lizard too, and other lower animals. And so when you have an emotion, it is felt, but at the same time, the prefrontal cortex gets a first stab at it. And it gets to decide, hey, wait a minute, how big do I want to feel this emotion right now? Or do I need to put that on ice because right now I'm giving a presentation, so if I need to, you know, be nervous, I'm just going to quell that, or whatever. If I'm feeling something, I'm going to ignore that right now because right now I got to focus on this. So the prefrontal cortex, what you're saying is some people do skip that prefrontal cortical activity area. And so yes, people with ADHD will potentially just let emotions kind of spew, right? Without a lot of filter. Because remember, it's not, prefrontal cortex is not just a filter for distractions on the way in. It is also a filter for things on the way in going out. Oh, I could get up and walk around now. No, you're sitting, you're listening to a lecture, right? You know, or, wow, that really upset me. I'm going to say something vitriolic back. No, that's not smart. He's your supervisor, right? You know, so that's your cortex's job, is to halt those things in the emotional stage. And so if this is fired up too much, cortex may not stand a chance, or if you've got a really flabby cortex, it may not be able to take this on. Either situation. Can you work with people like that? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you know, it may take more patience. And it may take serving as sort of their prosthetic prefrontal cortex for a little while. Absorbing some of that anger or sarcasm or sadness that they've got. Being able to tolerate being in the room with it and not get overwhelmed by it. Recognizing that even if they're being mean, it's probably underlying some real pain. Or scratch that reverse, the pain is underlying it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
In the case of traumatic brain injury, would both of you, I think, like to hear you comment about the use of art in helping folks who are victims of TBI.
I've never even thought about it.
The military's done a lot, and there was a National Geographic article on it.
Oh, that's
a long
wonderful.
time ago.
I would love to see it, but I'm also ignorant of it.
I just wondered in terms of neurotransmitters, that's what I was saying, because so many medications are being used for them and haven't worked very well.
Very true. medications are largely derived and created for a disorder that affects an otherwise normal brain, right? But when your brain gets jostled around by an IED, right, that's a structural problem, right? That's a Black and Decker issue, right? It's at the synapses, but it's like, actual stuff has gotten beaten around. And now brains have this remarkable propensity to regrow. And so would there be a benefit to doing art? I would say one of the great benefits would be, how are you going to regrow that brain that's taken such a hit? How do we want to choose to regrow it? And art might be a remarkable way because, if you're not paying careful, close attention, you can still do it and you can still enjoy it. You can go away and come back to it, right? That's one of the big problems they have is when they get jostled, a lot of times traumatic brain injury jostles front to back, so they injure their prefrontal cortex and their occipital lobe. And so there's a lot of prefrontal cortical damage in TBI. So, it's something that you could do with a prefrontal cortex that's trying to make its way back. I'd love to see that article, though. That's really cool. Yeah, yes. Okay, just Google it, Dr. Nelson. Yes. I will do that.
Yeah. So, the structure of the brain, the pathway, the dopamine response. If we're all created or have that structure the same, what's the difference between an addict brain and a non-addict brain, or is there? Between, like, if someone is an addict and someone is not an addict, why?
Yeah, I can. So there's something to say about the structure of the brain and the function of the brain. I would say, for the most part, the structure of the brain, we have a lot of similarities in the way the brain looks. And if you're going to do brain imaging, there's two ways of doing it. There's a way to do structural imaging where you take a snapshot of the way the folds of the brain are in different areas. Or you could look at the brain under different conditions of it being activated. And if you look at the brain of exactly like that, right? And if you look at the brain of probably most people, with the exception of alcoholism, because that does have an effect on the structure of the brain, it causes some shrinkage of the cortex. I'd say for the most part, the brain structure stays about the same. What changes is the functional properties of the brain, the way it's activated, the way it's stimulated, and what cues the activity of the brain. So this is a perfect example of somebody who's, this is direct cocaine administration. And actually, your question provokes a question that I don't know, is whether this is somebody who's addicted to cocaine or not. Because based off this alone, I couldn't tell. However, if we posed another question, was this individual showed images of cocaine? Were they stimulated by cues of cocaine? Then that most likely would be somebody who is addicted, because in that way it's stimulating the brain reward system. And so that becomes the difference. It's the way the brain's activated, not the structure itself.
The most dramatic demonstration of that I ever heard was, somebody quoted this study to me in which they showed people, they had them in a PET scanner, just looking at their nucleus accumbens area in particular, and showed them a bunch of different images, and in the middle of it, they showed them a picture of cocaine or cocaine paraphernalia for 1/30,000th of a second. Bing. No idea they had seen anything, right? And yet, their nucleus accumbens registered. And subjectively, they said, yeah, I felt a little craving. Let's do an experiment. Okay, can you voluntarily raise your hand? Okay, good. Now, I would like you to voluntarily control the pace of your breathing. Okay, so you can do that, right? You can control how fast you breathe. Now I'd like you to voluntarily control how fast your heart is going. If you're good, you might be able to do that to some, right? Okay, now I'd like you to change your body temperature. Yeah, right. Now, all of these things, okay, yeah, right, I can open my arms, yeah. All of these things are under control of your brain, but there's a spectrum between how voluntary some are and how involuntary some are, right? The difference, what takes, everybody has drives, everybody has desires, and everybody has a prefrontal cortex that is everything you know about happiness and joy, right? Or sorry, not prefrontal cortex, that's stupid. Everybody has a nucleus accumbens that says, I liked that yesterday, I want to do it again tomorrow. And it could be anything, it doesn't have to be drugs, right? It could be doing well at work, it could be getting a good grade on a test, it could be sex, crack, whatever. If you like it and you want to do it again tomorrow, that's dopamine in your nucleus accumbens, both good things and things we think of as bad things. What's the difference between that and an addiction? The difference is that the nucleus accumbens gets so attuned that what you see is a hijacking of other areas way down here that are largely in charge of a lot of decision-making processes that you have. Many of the decisions that we think we are making consciously are made before we ever think of them. They are involuntary. 90% or so of your decision making happens under the surface of the water. You never see it. And that's, so imagine an illness that could hijack that part of the brain that you have no conscious control of, right? But can make you do stuff and you don't even know you're being made to do it. And I found myself at the State Store. I'm not kidding. I have no idea how I got there, and yet I found myself at the State Store. Or I looked down and I had brought up the number that was still in my contacts list for my connection. So that's where it changes from, hey, this is fun, let's do it, to compulsion. It becomes less fun, it becomes more automatic. It's, yeah. Yeah.
So you were talking about medication. So with each illness, does that affect a different part of the brain? And then do you take the medication to correct that part of the brain?
Yeah, you want to take that one, John? No. If I tried to boil it down, you've got what? You've got mood disorders, psychotic disorders, anxiety disorders, and attention disorders. There's autism. I mean, you know, there's too much to talk about, right? But if I just try, I mean, when I do a psychiatric interview, those are the domains I always cover. Okay, I go through, you know, yeah, and the fact is that let's just say mood disorders. Let's just say depression, easiest mood disorder, not bipolar, because in depression, theoretically, I know which lobe, which neurotransmitter. I mean, I know various knobs and levers. Bipolar is actually much less well explored. But the fact of the matter is, there are elements of major depression that affect the VTA, nucleus accumbens, the prefrontal cortex, the occipital cortex. Various connections between them could be the problem. There's whole volumetric loss in a depressive episode. Like the longer you stay in it, your brain is actually shrinking a bit. Not as bad as psychotic disorders, but it's there. So none of these things happen in isolation. Oh yes, that is very much where psychiatry was in 1993 when I entered. Right? That this is a fan belt, that's a radiator, you know, and if something's squeaking, don't look at the radiator, right? Unfortunately, it turns out that it's a lot more interconnected, and that these things need to be viewed in a more whole pattern. You try to identify what's the biggest disorder and then what do I have evidence for treating, right? I mean, in the end, there's still a lot that's black box. But luckily, the good news is you can still prove that something works even if you don't know all the mechanisms as to why, right? I mean, the Brits figured out that limes cure scurvy 200 years before the concept of vitamin C, right? So we don't need to know all the wheres and whys of how it works. We can still prove that it works. We do large clinical trials, and we show that something works. And then you gotta make sure that you're actually treating what you think you're treating. And the problem is that sometimes symptoms aren't the same as the biology behind them. Some people look very much like they have one thing, but the biology doesn't follow that playbook at all. People are weird, brains are weird. I've been doing this 25 years, brains are weird. One more question in the back, yeah.
Hi, thank you both for being doctors. I've been in rehab at least 10 times. I suffer from a relapsing cocaine addiction that has branched into a polysubstance abuse, mood disorders, PTSD. I've got pretty much everything that we covered. The description Dr. Nelson just gave of the feeling of the unconscious controlling much of our decisions and coming to the point where the prefrontal cortex tries to intervene but fails many, many times. And when it succeeds only as the result of great discomfort. So I end up in a very uncomfortable position if I am able to keep myself from taking drugs. You know, is there anything new coming? Is there a new treatment that is on the horizon here that isn't just go to meetings, get a big book, and talk to your sponsor? You know, what are we looking at here? What's next?
The thing is, I do have to put a plug in though for that really super old treatment. Because if you frame that question that way, then think about it. In 1939, a bunch of non-scientists, like amateur guys, sat around in a room and said, well, what if willpower had nothing to do with this? Everybody's telling us have more willpower, and yet all of us have sort of figured out independently that willpower doesn't seem to, we have great willpower when it has to do with other aspects of our lives, but it seems as though there's something going on here that this is outside of our conscious control. They turned everything on its head. So not everybody responds to 12-step at all, but I do have to give them a lot of credit because like Dr. Harris was saying, these relationships were not known really even like when I started this field quite in as much detail as, no, I'm not that old, but, say 75 years ago, certainly when AA was created, dopamine was not known. They didn't know what dopamine was as a chemical. They certainly didn't know where it existed in the brain. And yet, these guys knew that whatever was in charge of their conscious decision-making was getting hijacked. And their answer was, we need something to appeal to something higher than that. How do we take control out of these regions? And how do we retake control of this region? And they chose spirituality, and it doesn't work for everybody. And I gotta admit, it wouldn't work for me. I've tried. I no spiritual bone in my, none. So it doesn't work for everybody. What they chose was spirituality, and what do you do in a meeting? You take those repeated experiences and you bring them down from here and you lift them up into cortical areas. You remind yourself every meeting how awful things were and how much better they are now. So you keep yourself in a constant process of rehashing so that it stays on a conscious level. You get other people who will notice the subconscious signs that you won't see yourself to call you out. And to say, hey, I see signs, that's a relapse behavior. You're not thinking about it, but I can tell because I've been there, I can smell it. And The fact of the matter is, God has access to things I don't. As much as that really makes me mad as a scientist, God has access to things that I don't. And is there something new? Is there something at Karen they're brewing up?
So there's things on the menu already, and there's a couple things coming to the menu, but I don't know that these couple things are all the powerful end-all be-all answer that we don't already have, but there may be some barriers for certain individuals, and I don't know what they are for everybody. I would be happy to chat with you afterwards.
That'd be nice.
Dr. Jonathan, tell us in like 2 sentences the studies that you're working on.
Sure.
And then I have one comment about that conversation, which is the other thing I think that happens in fellowship is in that emotional area of the
Oh, yeah.
brain, that the social connection of people, it like strengthens that emotional area. And the other thing is that the pleasure areas come back, that range that Jonathan was talking about, the flavors.
But I would argue it's a different pleasure.
Yes.
And I don't know, but I believe it's located somewhere other than the nucleus accumbens. It's not pleasure, it's more like joy. It's, and
Human connection, it's like at the base, it's like.
or
so-
spiritual awakening, that feeling of, that inner light, it's different than, wow, what a great piece of cake. It's just a different phenomenon.
I mean, it's.
Okay, it depends on the cake, but, but it is different,
Yeah.
right? And I agree, trust me, I've thought a lot about this subject, and I think that is what they are tapping into, and I guess that's what I'm shortcutting when I say God has access to things I don't. I mean, I think that, yes, maybe it is the communal connection fellowship, maybe it is something higher than us.
And also the now more understood meditation benefits too, that are like about self-regulating.
Yes.
it's-
Which is one of your areas, right?
So I can speak to a couple of projects that we're working on now. One project that we've been working on for a couple of years now, and we're looking at it through different lenses, is there something about the brain, is there something about the way the brain is activated under certain conditions that could indicate that somebody is still very vulnerable to relapsing after they leave? Is there a marker in the brain that can indicate that? And there are some things that suggest the answer to that is yes, but the thing is it's so complex. There's so many variables. One, the brain itself is so complex. And then when somebody leaves treatment, the variables of living day-to-day life are even more complex. So it's important that that's something that's studied and replicated again. But there is some indication that there's at least something about that we can measure that would suggest, okay, this is somebody who really does need more care, or at least is a certain increased level of care than just going back home. So that's one project we've been working on, and we're going to continue to work on. Another project that there's a lot of interest in is looking at, actually it's lined up with meditation, is the issue when somebody first starts meditating, especially if they have ADHD, or they just sit down and they bounce it right. Yeah. And maybe after 30 seconds they're gone and they don't even realize they're gone. And so meditation is almost an impossibility for them, which I'm kind of like that too, actually. Is there something that's happening in the brain that lines up directly with spacing out, that lines up with that attention? And there are. And getting that very clear, and can you measure that, and can you measure that in real time? Can you measure that when somebody sits down in a chair and is meditating? And can that signal be detected and then relay back to the person saying, hang on, you just spaced out, come on back. And so that's a kind of research, that's a very particular kind of research that we've been talking with some researchers at Brown to take a look at that, which would basically be a kind of mindfulness-based meditative neurofeedback. Right? What you're doing is you're looking into a mirror where the brain is actually being shown into you. Does it indicate that you're spaced out right now? To what degree are you paying attention? And having that mirror back to you in real time, consistently. And that's really promising, because then once you get that, you don't need it anymore. You can move beyond it. and then you're kind of free and you can meditate more and more and more. So I'm really excited about that. And those are probably our two biggest things that I'm interested in.
All right, well, I just want to thank both of them again. And I was so excited that, first of all, that someone besides me and Dane and Kelly, Kelly, we were like, we're gonna ask all the questions if nobody else comes. I've got a question for her. So I'm really thrilled that other people came. And you're welcome to hang out. Like I said, enjoy the art and the other room. I really encourage you to go back and look at some of the wonderful answers that our doctors provided. And also, I just want to thank you again. I had no idea what they were going to say. It was like, talk about these subjects. I'm thinking, I hope they know something about those subjects. I'm pretty sure they do, but it was so fascinating to me. So fascinating, right? So interesting. So I'm glad that you have it completely figured out and explained to us. You know, completely understand everything. No more questions? So, thank you. I also wanted to say, how they got this one right here, because I'm doing everything.